I never imagined that one night could change the course of my life. Yet that is exactly what happened that night. My name is Amelia, and here is the tale of how I lost everything and ended up in the dead of winter. So it had been yet another exhausting workday, when the fluorescent lights seemed to be draining everyone. Ounce of vitality from your body, I recall stumbling up the stairs to our small two-story suburban home. As I fumbled with my keys, I could see my breath in the cold air. I discovered a strange disturbance within my spouse Richard, who was never one for change. To my delight, the sound of his excited voice coming through the door was a testament to his cool-headedness. Took me by surprise. So I pushed open the door to find our home's warmth and a nice respite from the bitter weather outside. Richard was pacing back and forth in our living room, holding a piece of paper, and the scene that met my eyes was unreal. His hands tangled his normally combed hair, as if he'd been rubbing his fingers through it. His movements were irregular, and his eyes were wide, almost manic, on several occasions. "Richard!" I yelled as I placed my suitcase on the counter, asking what was happening before I could even pull off my coat. He turned to me, his cheeks inflamed. "Amelia," he yelled, a mixture of excitement and something else I couldn't quite place. "I won $50 million. Can you believe that for a second?" His voice was shaking with enthusiasm. $50 million felt unattainable as I stood there frozen in shock. The recession had struck, and we had been facing financial difficulties for nearly 2 years. Richard's small business was struggling, and we were drowning in debt. So we put our plans to start a family on indefinite hold. This windfall could change everything. And as I imagined what this fortune may imply, my heart grew hopeful. For our future together, there won't be any more restless nights spent fretting about money. Discussions had always revolved around whether we could finally start a family, and whether we could afford to fix the leaky roof. Oh my God! I hurried forward and threw my arms around Richard. "Amazing," I said, my voice faltering with enthusiasm. "How did this happen?" Richard pulled away from me, his eyes brightening. "And I bought a ticket. I nearly forgot about it yesterday on my way home from work, but when I looked at the numbers this morning, I saw that we're wealthy." Richard's excitement increased, but I saw that Amelia and I were ready for life. It was unsettling that his normally friendly tone had turned colder and more distant. He is no longer speaking about us or our lives, but rather about his ambitions and his next moves. It was subtle at first, but it became unavoidable as the evening progressed. Richard thought more about himself than about me, but I'm considering purchasing the sports car I've always wanted. "Perhaps we could check out a larger home with an ocean view," which sounds amazing, I remarked, attempting to participate in we are organizing the trip to Europe that we've been wanting to take for a long time. Richard's reaction to my idea surprised me. His face twisted into an irritated expression, as though I had yelled at him. Something disrespectful was said, and he laughed at Amelia. "This is my victory. I purchased the ticket. I feel as though I've received a slap in the face, because I thought I had the authority to decide how to spend the money." Richard had never said it to me in our years of marriage. We had always worked together as a team, sharing our successes and setbacks. Similarly, it seemed as though I had abruptly become an outsider in my own world. I tried to sound calm as I said, "Marriage, Richard," believing that we were in it together, though we've always shared everything. He laughed without love. That's when we had the situation has shifted, leaving nothing to discuss. Richard's behavior became more unpredictable as the night went on. He called his friends to boast about his victory and make extravagant promises. He even called his mother. Evelyn, who lived a few towns away, had a loud voice that I could hear over the phone, and her excitement matched Richard's. I attempted to interrupt, hoping to bring some normalcy back to our evening, but Richard dismissed my attempts. That night I went to bed alone, feeling as though I had disappeared, a ghost in my own home. The following morning, Richard remained downstairs engrossed in his ideas about being wealthy. I awoke with the hope that things would have changed. Perhaps Richard had simply been overcome by the excitement of victory. Perhaps in the daylight, he would recall our identities and our significance to one another. But as I descended the steps, Richard was standing in the living room with a stack of papers in his hand, and I could see right away that something was up. His mother, Evelyn, was standing behind him, her lips curving into a smug smirk. Amelia Richard spoke in a chilly, business-like tone, and I felt a need to talk. Richard thrust. "What's going on? And why is your mother here?" "It's making me shiver." The divorce papers were directed towards me, and as I accepted them, my heart sank. "You won't receive any money from me," because he spat venom, erasing any evidence of the married man. "Sign these documents and receive." I looked at him in shock as I left my house, knowing that I owed him nothing more. The world is collapsing around me. This couldn't have happened yesterday. A typical marriage is in trouble, but now together, due to a fortunate event. Evelyn clapped her hands behind Richard, discarding them like yesterday's trash. "Expel this witch," she said to Richard, smiling as if the entire situation was a farce for her amusement. "You possess the wealth of your life." I glanced first at Richard, then at Evelyn, and then back again. I was searching for the people I thought I knew again, but their eyes were cold and unrecognizable. With trembling hands, I placed the papers on the coffee table in calculated greed. "Richard, you can't be serious," I murmured, scarcely raising my voice above a whisper. We've been married for 5 years and have experienced a lot together. How can you disregard that?" Richard's expression stayed neutral as he signed the documents. "Amelia, I came to the realization that the life I had created with the guy I loved had been nothing more than a choiceless fantasy. However, in order to cope with this sudden betrayal, I packed Evelyn's teasing and numbly gathered what possessions I could carry. An enthusiastic voice accompanied me from room to room, outlining everything Richard would purchase with his money. An hour later, with just one duffel bag at my feet, I stood on the front porch of the house that had once been my home, while the winter wind nipped at my face. But I hardly noticed it. The betrayal ache was much less intense as I looked too. As I was leaving, I caught a last glimpse of Richard through the window. He was probably already using his phone. His ambitions for his new opulent lifestyle excluded me with a heavy heart. I didn't dare turn around and didn't know where I was when I walked down the driveway and into the frigid night. Going or my next course of action? All I knew was that in a single night, I had learned everything I believed to be true about Mai. I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a journey that would upend my life, my marriage, and the guy I loved. Path that would put me to the test in ways I never would have thought possible, and eventually reveal a strength the Sleepy Pine Motel's neon sign, a last resort beacon, flickered feebly in the darkness. That evening, as I strolled through the nearly empty parking lot, I found myself among those individuals who had nowhere else to turn. The night I requested a room and slid a key, Clark hardly looked up, and my duffel bag felt heavier with every step. Without a word, across the worn counter, room 17 was just what you would anticipate from a low-cost motel. On the edge of the wallpaper was fading. The bed was sinking, and the heater made more noise than it did. It was heated, but that was all I could ask for at the moment. I collapsed onto the bed, my head spinning. Richard and I were just yesterday, and based on the events of the last few hours, how had everything fallen apart so quickly? We were making plans for the future together, and now I found myself alone in a filthy hotel room. All I could hear was the drab hum of the old heater and a bag of hurriedly packed clothes. In an attempt to make sense of everything Richard's expression kept saying, I brought my knees to my chest to break the suffocating silence. Not the devoted husband I believed I knew, but this new vicious version suggests the possibility of his statement. "You're not getting a dime from me," kept repeating itself in my mind. How could money change someone so drastically? Suddenly, Evelyn Richard's mother appeared, laughing. She had never approved of me, always believing Richard could do it. And her laughter still echoed in my ears as I packed my belongings. I suppose she felt that $50 million was finally enough to buy her a decent night's sleep. I tossed and turned that night, reliving the events of the day repeatedly. Richard's voice altered as he began speaking, and I could see the joy in his eyes when he first informed me about the victory. When he handed me the divorce papers and spoke in a cold, business-like manner about his money, every memory was a twisting nightmare. The first rays of light peeked through the threadbare drapes, causing my weary thoughts to wander. The previous week's recollection was a little but noteworthy event at the time, but it now burned in my brain like a beacon. As part of a small ritual, I had made a stop at the local store on my way home from work. The past few months have been challenging for me due to Richard's struggling business and our growing family. Debts are quick pauses where I reward myself with a candy bar or even. That day, lottery tickets were my means of adding a little whimsy to our already strained existence. Do you recall receiving a small lottery ticket book from the cashier? Martha, a kind elderly woman, had I smiled at her, feeling fortunate today, sweetie. She had asked, and I had shivered with laughter. Occasionally, it's enjoyable to dream. You know, when I arrived home, I showed Richard the ticket, and we laughed at the thought of unexpectedly winning, joking about the absurdly low odds. Richard had pondered, if we were to become millionaires, what would we even do with that much money? Pay off our debts first. Perhaps go to Europe. We've always discussed Richard, was the response. Had nodded and murmured, yeah, that would be nice, with his eyes far away. But there was, I assumed, work-related stress because his tone was odd. I wondered as I lay in that motel bed whether or not greed had taken root in his mind. When I purchased the ticket I saw another detail from that memory, when I was looking at the water-stained ceiling. As usual, I registered it online, using my real name and email address. When I realized I had won the $50 ticket, my eyes sprung wide. Suddenly I sat up, realizing that I, not Richards, was the owner of the million that had ruined my life. Could it be true that I frantically grabbed my laptop and thanked whatever God I was praising? Maybe listening, I had considered grabbing it in my hurried packing. And while I waited for it to start up, my thoughts were racing. If the Richard legally owned the money because the ticket was registered in my name, I opened my email and frantically scrolled through my saved messages, but I was unable to claim them because my hands were shaking. I clicked on a confirmation email from the Lottery Commission, dated the day I purchased the ticket. As I perused the details, my breath seized up. The winning draw's ticket number and the name on the eye laughed hysterically because my registration was for Amelia Rossi, not Richard Rossi. Richard had been boasting about his victory for a long time, and it suddenly flooded my chest with emotion. I planned for his money, but for a moment, it was mine. Felt a rush of vengeful joy. Wouldn't it be ideal justice to phone Richard at this moment and tell him the truth? His voice was shocked as he realized that he had wasted our marriage, but the sensation came swiftly, diminished, and was replaced by a profound sense of emptiness because, even though the money was mine, didn't alter the basic reality of what had transpired. Richard had still prioritized fortune over our union. He continued to present himself as someone I didn't know, someone I couldn't love or trust. So I turned off my laptop and lay down. After returning to bed and looking at the ceiling, the irony persisted. I had nothing yesterday, but today I felt worth $50 million. As the dawn rose, I felt poorer than I had ever felt in my life, if anything richer. The sky overhead illuminated the dull motel room in shades of gold, presenting me with a crossroads. What was I going to do? Today, the funds created numerous opportunities, but they also brought their own challenges. Richard would undoubtedly fight for it. despite my own set of obstacles. And even if I kept everything, how would it change me? Would I become like Richard, consumed by selfishness and greed? I pondered whether I could return to my work, my friends, and the life I had created in Boston. Given what I've learned, the idea of having to defend myself in front of everyone is daunting. My stomach turned over because of what had transpired, and I knew I couldn't go back. Yet I could move forward with a renewed feeling of purpose, so I got out of bed and began making plans. First, I needed to secure the prizes, which meant contacting the Lottery Commission and likely hiring a lawyer. I also required, even though I loved the atmosphere of the Sleepy Pine Motel, I needed to look for a more permanent location to stay. As I wrote down my to-do list, I saw a spark of inspiration for a long-term solution. I felt a surge of joy in my chest because, for the first time in years, I had complete control over my destiny and could no longer compromise. I'm going to stop biting my tongue around Evelyn in order to support Richard's ambitions, maintain harmony. I had the freedom to travel anywhere and do anything. But what did I actually do? Perhaps now was the time for me to fulfill a lifelong goal of exploring the world outside of our quiet suburban town. My opportunity, I could go to Europe on the trip we've always discussed, but on my own terms, or perhaps I'd go farther, I could now explore the entire world, including Asia, Africa, and South America. As I packed up my small life, I embarked on a more urgent journey to reclaim my life and identity. As I packed up my possessions and left the motel, a range of emotions churned in my chest. Dread, excitement, uncertainty, and hope. However, beneath it all was a steely resolve. Richard and Evelyn had attempted to ignore me in order to make me feel I was worthless, but they misjudged me. I was stronger than they realized. Then I realized, and I was going to demonstrate it as I stepped outside in the brilliant Boston morning. I inhaled deeply for the first time since this entire ordeal began. The fresh winter air tugged at my lips with a genuine smile. Had shut behind me, but a new one had opened, and I was prepared to enter it and go on whatever adventure lay ahead. However, I didn't know which chapter would be most rewarding and difficult. My life was just getting started, and the days that followed were filled with meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. I discovered the apartment I rented on a month-to-month basis was nothing special, but it was tidy, peaceful, and most significantly, it served as a haven for me while I negotiated the rough waters of my new reality. Sarah, a perceptive lawyer, was the first person I called, who focused on lottery cases, listened to my narrative with a mixture of professional attention and sympathy. And then I have outlined a strategy to safeguard my winnings. And the good news is that the ticket is clearly registered. Legally, the money is in your name. But given the circumstances, we should be prepared. Your husband should dispute it. I nodded, not feeling queasy at the prospect of going to court with Richard. But Sarah's. The words, "Don't worry, Amelia, we'll be ready for anything," eased my anxiety. With Sarah's help, I called the Lottery Commission and began the procedure of dealing with everything he throws at us. Even though the process of claiming my prizes would take some time, at least it was underway. After settling into my new life and apartment, I discovered that I was alternating between a variety of feelings. I would experience lifelong grief one moment and be ecstatic about the potential that awaited me the next. The love I'd lost, and occasionally, out of the blue, a boiling rage would flare up within me. I blame myself for not realizing the truth about them sooner, and Richard for betraying Evelyn for her crew-our glee. I spent most of my time in the apartment, partly due to my desire for solitude, and partly due to my fear. Richard or anyone else familiar with us understood that I couldn't maintain my secrecy indefinitely. The encounter I had been dreading was inevitable, and came 3 days after I had left our home. A sudden violent tap on my door startled me awake at home, and for a few minutes I lay still in bed, my heart frozen. There was another round of pounding, this time more intense, and a voice I was too familiar with, Amelia, joined in. "Richard, you're in there. Open the door." I inhaled deeply, robbing myself for. In anticipation of what lay ahead, I put on a robe and walked silently on the cool hardwood floor to the door in my bare feet. When I answered the door, Richard was already there, looking shockingly well-groomed after years of. He appeared to have just slept in his wrinkled clothes and disheveled hair, but his eyes truly surprised me. He thundered past me, his red-rimmed eyes filled with agitation, darting about wildly before landing on me. "Where is Amelia?" I entered the flat without waiting for an invitation, and as soon as I walked in, the smell of alcohol turned my stomach. I checked my account this morning, but the jackpot didn't go through. "Where is my money? You stole it, didn't you? Could you do this to me?" His boldness left me speechless for a moment. Despite everything he had done, he had the audacity to accuse me of stealing, which caused a wave of rage to surge through me. Initially, I asked, "Your money?" in a mocking tone, and I watched him placidly as he roamed my tiny living room like a pet in a cage. "Did you not look at the ticket?" My inquiry lingered in the air like Richard, whose name is announced as the winner. A thunderclap. Richard stopped in the middle of his step, his face going pale as I spoke. I could just see his mind spinning as he took in what I had said, and he scrambled for his phone. He took it out of his pocket with trembling hands, and I watched as he hurriedly looked for what was likely he believed he had no confirmation email, and he mumbled just over a murmur, "No, that isn't feasible. I bought the ticket, checked the numbers, and confirmed that it is mine." "Sure, you might have purchased the ticket," I continued, maintaining my composure in spite of my roiling emotions. "But I registered. Just like I've done with every lottery ticket we've ever purchased. I have it registered in my name." Richard's head jerked up and his eyes met mine. His desperate expression nearly made me feel sorry for him. He stumbled, his arrogance giving way to pure fear. I nodded, a somber sense of satisfaction washing over me. "Yes, Richard, you were quick to claim $50 million as your own, but it's all mine." Richard's transformation at that precise moment was astounding. As the irate, accusing guy who had rushed into a few minutes ago, the apartment seemed to crumble before my eyes, his face drooping and his shoulders hunching. Alert, his legs collapsed beneath him, and I stared in disbelief as my husband was soon to. When my ex-husband fell on the floor of my living room, I initially believed he was. I thought he was playing a prank of some sort. But when the seconds passed and he didn't move, I knew this wasn't an act. When Richard didn't respond to my call, I tentatively moved towards him. "Richard, can you hear me?" I squatted next to him, my rage momentarily forgotten in the face of a possible medical emergency. His eyes were open but unfocused, gazing at the ceiling in a blank manner. With a start, I realized that the rapid, shallow breathing was a symptom of. Despite everything I'd done, I'd experienced enough panic attacks in the last few days to know what they looked like. I couldn't abandon him like this, so I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911. While I waited for the paramedics to come, I explained the scenario to the operator. Unsure of what to do, I sat down beside Richard on the floor. A part of me wanted to reassure him that everything would be all right. Be okay. But there's another part of me that remembers his harsh remarks and his casual disdain of our years spent together. Held me back, but the paramedics' prompt arrival and effective professionalism stood in sharp contrast to the I promptly evaluated Richard for the emotional turmoil of the previous hour, which confirmed my suspicion that he was experiencing a panic attack. With assistance, Richard managed to sit up, and his breathing gradually returned to normal. His cheeks began to flush again, and I noticed embarrassment and guilt creep into his face. He couldn't look me in the eye. When the paramedics were satisfied, he answered their queries with little more than mumbling monosyllables. Richard was not in immediate danger. As the paramedics were about to depart, one of them turned to face me with gentle eyes, crinkling at the edges. "Are you comfortable here, or do you want us to take over?" Richard was still sitting on my floor, looking confused, and I thought about sending him to the hospital for additional observation. Little did I see the man I had just put aside, not the one who had cried. I had shared dreams with the man with whom I had built a life and loved for years. Despite everything, I experienced a wave of sympathy, and I told myself, "I'll be all right." After the paramedics left, an awkward silence fell over the flat Richard stayed in. "Thank you for coming." He placed his hands on the floor and I stood at the window, staring out. When the city woke up, uncertain of what to say or do next, Richard finally raised his voice. "I apologize, Amelia," barely audible over a whisper. "I'm uncertain about what transpired with me. I panicked when I discovered the money wasn't in my account because I assumed you had—" I turned to face him, crossing my arms, but he somehow took it from me. "You, Richard?" I said again, unable to control my sarcasm. "It was never." He nodded, but he didn't look into my eyes at first. I know that now. I didn't stop because I was so consumed by the idea of being wealthy, all the things I could do and all the problems I could solve, to consider us. "No," I answered quietly. "You didn't." At last, Richard glanced up at his red-rimmed eyes, begged me to engage in a conversation about this. Perhaps we could. Maybe we could still live the life we always wanted if we could figure out a way to divide the money. For a brief moment, I contemplated going back to our former lives. The simplicity of pretending that none of this had occurred was alluring. But then I remembered Richard's expression. While packing my belongings, I heard Evelyn laughing as he handed me the divorce papers, to which I shook my head. "No. We can't go back, Richard. When you were convinced that you possessed all of that money, you disclosed your true self to me, and I will never forget it." "However, Amelia," I raised a hand as he began to speak in a desperate tone. "Richard, I think you should leave now. My lawyer will contact you." He opened his lips to argue about the divorce proceedings, then shut them. Once more he stood up slowly, swaying a little as he walked toward the door. He stopped and turned back to face me. I sincerely apologized to Amelia, for I nodded in agreement, not believing that I could speak. And when he left, with a gentle click that seemed to reverberate in the abrupt quiet of my room, the door closed behind him, and I slumped onto I had finished the conversation I had been dreading, but it left me with more questions. Couch was emotionally spent, then responses, and as the first rays of sunshine came through my window, I understood that this was simply the actual struggle for the funds for my future and self-worth was remained to come. But for the first time since the start of this entire ordeal, I felt prepared to face any obstacles that might arise. Since I now realize that I am stronger than Richard and Evelyn, I will confront them head-on than anyone had acknowledged. And in the days after Richard's surprise arrival, I was prepared to show it. We're a tornado of feelings and activities, and I poured myself into the process of getting my cash from the lottery. My attorney Sarah was a blessing because she provided a distraction from my personal life stress. She handled the tricky legal waters with assurance that I found comforting. She was always prepared with a strategy, for Sarah told me during one of our meetings that we had submitted the required documentation to the Lottery Commission for every possible impediment of our meetings. Considering the situation, they're speeding up the procedure. With any, we hope to send the money to the safe account we established within the next 2 weeks. I continued to nod, a little overwhelmed by the scope of it all. "And Richard, do you think he'll attempt to contest it?" Sarah's face became contemplative. "Perhaps the ticket is, we have a solid legal position, because it is clearly registered in your name. However, considering the sum of money involved, I should be prepared for him to try something, but I paused when my phone rang, and a text message from Richard on cue arrived. Prior to opening it and robbing myself for additional charges or entreaties, I discover something surprising, Amelia. I've been thinking about everything I know. Messed up. Is there any possibility we might speak? Perhaps over coffee? I swear I glanced at the message, feeling conflicted and wanting to chat. I wanted to ignore it and keep going forward without turning around. But there was also a part of me that I still remembered the delightful times we shared, and I felt compelled to pay attention to him. What do you think I said to Sarah to illustrate her point? She scowled at the message, her legal mind obviously considering the ramifications. Amelia, it's entirely up to you, but if you're interested in meeting him, I highly recommend. Opposed to talking about the lottery or the divorce process without my presence at the end out of curiosity. Ultimately, I agreed to meet Richard at a small cafe near my apartment. As I anxiously waited for him, I stirred my coffee and thought of all the times we had spent together in cafes like this. Richard appeared more like his former self, looking clean, and it felt like a lifetime ago that we were planning our future together. He was wearing the blue button-down shirt I'd always admired, with his hair shaved and combed, but there was a new hesitation in. As he walked toward the table, his eyes were tired. "Thanks for meeting me, Amelia," he muttered, slipping into. I wasn't sure whether you would, so I nodded while maintaining my expression in the seat across from me. Richard took a big breath and said, "Neutral, what did you want to talk about?" I wanted to apologize for my fidgeting fingers with the sugar sachets on the table. Please accept my sincere apologies. I've had some tough times lately. Time to reflect has allowed me to see how badly I acted. I listened in silence. As Richard kept expressing his apologies and justifications, he discussed the strain of his failing business, and the possibility of unexpected money drove him insane. I became engrossed in a fantasy in which he confessed, in a voice brimming with guilt. Money might fix all of my issues and allow me to accomplish everything I had always wanted to do, but I lost sight of what was truly important as I watched him. I had a complex range of feelings, including wrath, and I was stung. But I also felt a little sorry for the man seated opposite from me. He reminded me more of Richard. When Richard finally met my eyes and whispered, "I know I don't deserve it," I was filled with hope. I had known and loved him for years. I was tempted to think that perhaps we might try to start over and work things out. In its simplicity, the notion of returning to our lives and acting as though the previous week had never occurred was alluring. However, I recalled the icy expression on his face as he gave me those divorce documents in a casual manner. Putting years of love and collaboration aside, I slowly shook my head and apologized to Richard. However, a lot has transpired, and I can't return to the previous state of affairs. I'm not sure what I know now, but Richard nodded as though he had anticipated my remark. I get it. We sat in silence for a short while, but I had to give it a shot. There was a noticeable discomfort between us, and at last Richard spoke again, but his tone was uncertain. "What will happen with the money now?" I felt my defenses immediately rise. "I believe it would be best if we let our attorneys handle that conversation." Richard opened his mouth to object, then reconsidered. "You're right, of course, but I hope you understand that I never meant." As we said our goodbyes, I couldn't get rid of the impression that this talk wasn't. I was right. The next morning, a loud noise woke me up, persistent knocking on my door. I briefly thought it might be Richard once more, but the voice calling my name wasn't. "We need to communicate, so Amelia, open this door for us right now." I moaned as I realized I headed to the door, bracing myself for the loud tones of Evelyn, Richard's mother, as she pulled on a robe. Confrontation to come. Evelyn exploded in her face, flushed with rage, before I could even unlock the door. "How dare you attempt to embezzle my son's money?" She spat at me with a finger. She blinked in surprise as she said, "Evelyn, I'm not stealing anything," she sneered as she paced my tiny space, even though the ticket was in my name and the money was legally mine. "We all know that Richard purchased that ticket and is the one, so stop acting like a caged animal in the living room." Her remarks hurt me, but I made myself keep my cool. Who deserves such money? Not some gold-digging kid like you. "I won't talk to you about this, Evelyn. Richard can hire a lawyer if he's worried about the lottery wins." "Oh, don't be too arrogant with me." I know, Evelyn scoffed. "Contact me. You've been preparing for this the entire time, haven't you? You've been anticipating your opportunity to steal everything from Richard." I felt my rage flare up, and the cal I'd been trying to keep going started to slide. "Take everything from him, please. Are you serious? Do you know what I have paid off my debts and put my goals on hold throughout this marriage." Evelyn waved her hand dismissively. "Richard has provided you with a comfortable life and enjoyable vacations at home. The only thing I did for myself in that absurd art class you were constantly talking about was, for years I kept my voice quiet and focused on helping others. Richard's company, his goals, and the instant he believed he had money, he was prepared to discard me like yesterday's garbage." But Evelyn appeared surprised for a brief period. Despite my outburst, she quickly recovered. "Well, what did you expect? If you can't support your spouse, it may be time to end the marriage. If that's what you believe, then you should break up after all." I gazed at her, not believing what I was hearing. "Marriage is about supporting one another, Evelyn. I'm sorry for you." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare pity me, you." No one was giving up everything for the other. An ungrateful little witch. "I've been married for 40 years and have a successful son. What do you know about genuine partnerships over the years?" I tried taking a deep breath. "To clarify, I understand that it doesn't mean abandoning your spouse as soon as you feel you have achieved financial success. I'm positive it doesn't entail continuing to manipulate and undermine your daughter-in-law for years. Entails storming into someone's house and insulting them." For a little while, Evelyn appeared speechless. Her expression turned into a trap. "You believe in your intelligence, don't you? Let me tell you something. Richard belongs to the family that owns the money. Family, you are nothing more than a fortunate individual, and we will ensure this." She stormed out of my apartment, slamming the door behind her. And everyone knew it. After the altercation, I slumped onto my couch with trembling hands and enough force behind her to rattle the windows. Despite my feelings of exhaustion and rage, I sensed a rising sense of something else. For years, I had gone above and beyond to get Richard's approval. And Evelyn, I had swallowed my pride and set aside my personal goals. I chose to stop being a lovely wife and daughter-in-law because I felt deceived, disrespected, and alone. I stopped prioritizing the happiness of others over my own, and I stopped trying to impress those who clearly didn't value me. Who wouldn't reciprocate? I grabbed my phone and dialed Sarah's number. When she answered, I wasted no time. "Anyhow, Sarah, this is Amelia. I need your advice, Richard. After viciously abusing me, my mother recently left my flat, and I'm afraid she and Richard may try to discredit me. What precautions can Sarah and I take to contest the lottery prizes?" As I began to lay out our alternatives, a wave of peace washed over me. This was not the life I had dreamed of. Since it was the life I had now, I was determined to face it head-on. Richard and Evelyn had established the battle lines and shown their true strength and bravery. It was now my turn to showcase my own colors. I might have begun this adventure, as despite being a victim, I was determined to overcome any challenges that arose. As I was now, I was ready to prove to them and to myself that I was stronger than they had ever acknowledged. The weeks following my encounters with Richard and Evelyn were filled with a flurry of activity. Guided by Sarah's expert guidance, negotiated the difficult lotto claim process. It was a bizarre sight to see my bank. Congratulations. My balance went from barely covering my rent to a number with more zeros than I could have ever dreamed. As we concluded, Amelia Sarah's normally solemn visage broke into a rare smile. The document that said, "You're officially a multi-millionaire," filled my mind as I gazed at it. I acknowledged feeling a little overwhelmed by the fact that I don't really know what to do with all of this money. Sarah's mood shifted from being overwhelmed to being contemplative, so I recommended that you spend some time. Consider your true desires, avoid rash actions, and so forth. You haven't yet told anyone about your winnings, but I nodded in appreciation. Her insight as I walked out of her office that day, experiencing a peculiar mixture of fear. While the money presented Sarah with numerous opportunities, it also presented a number of challenges. I needed time to comprehend the information, so I kept the news of my gains to myself. All that had happened and the next step. But as time went on, I realized I was struggling with an issue. Suddenly I found myself awash in wealth beyond my imagination, leading to an unexpected sense of embarrassment. However, it felt unjust to keep all that money for myself while so many others were suffering. At that moment, an idea struck me, prompting me to reach out to a nearby women's shelter, the same organization that had helped me years before. Before I met Richard, I was in the process of leaving an abusive relationship, and I remembered how their assistance had been a lifeline during that time. During one of the most difficult times in my life, I called the director, Carol, and said, "I would like to make a donation." Carol's astonishment was quite evident in her voice. "Kind of you, Amelia. Could you please tell me what caused this?" I was hesitant not to. Without going into too much detail about my situation, let's just say that I recently earned some money and would like to use it for assistance. We arranged a meeting with individuals facing challenges, and a few days later, I found myself sitting in Carol's office. The shelter, a small office, was still a little run down but cozy, and hadn't altered much since I'd been there. "Greetings," Amelia Carol remarked, her gentle gaze examining me with interest. "What did you?" I took a deep breath and decided to create a fund with your donation in mind. I began to speak with more strength as I advocated for a fund to assist women attempting to escape abusive situations. After a divorce, it might help them rebuild their life by paying for things like childcare, career training, legal bills, and other necessities. Carol's eyes widened as they stood back up. "Which is rather, Amelia, I appreciate your kindness, but the cost of setting up something similar would be significant." I gave a little nod. With a smile on my face, "I'm ready to start by donating $5 million. Carol had an almost hilarious expression of disbelief on her face. Amelia gasped, "That's amazing. Are you sure?" "I'm positive I stated that this shelter saved me when I needed it most, and now that I feel more certain than I have in weeks, I want to repay it." As we worked through the details of the fund, I felt a sense of relief for the first time in a long time. When I won the lotto, I thought I was using the money for something worthwhile, but my quest for self-awareness. The rebuilding continued after I decided that my immediate future was secure. It was time to focus on my personal goals and desires, which I had been putting off for years. I've always enjoyed drawing, but I put away my painting supplies years ago in order to concentrate on advancing Richard's career. I chose to rekindle that enthusiasm using the time and resources I had available. Enrolling in art classes at a nearby studio, I entered my first session, feeling both anxious and delighted. As I set up my easel, I couldn't help but notice that the room was filled with the smell of paint and the quiet chatter of people. A kind voice asked, and I turned to see a woman who seemed a little out of place. She smiled at me and said she was Lisa, who is about my age. Evidently, I laughed as I felt a little more relaxed. Lisa shook her head, but please bear in mind the emotions I experienced when I first began, and do not be concerned. You will seamlessly integrate into the environment." As the weeks went by, I discovered who I was. There was something so liberating about immersing myself in the act that I found myself looking forward to my art classes more and more, of creation, allowing my feelings to spill onto the painting. and to my amazement, Amelia, our teacher David informed us that you have a genuine talent and weren't at all poor at it. I was happy when he looked at my most recent item one day. Have you ever considered showcasing your work? I'm still learning, David, I whispered cautiously, feeling a sense of fear, grinned encouragingly. Although we're all still learning, your work is unique, since it features people who are honest and unvarnished. His remarks stayed with me as I continued to work long after the class ended. I discovered that I was putting more and more of my experiences into my paintings at home, including Richard's suffering. The joy of rediscovering myself, the dread and uncertainty of starting over, and betrayal all entered my mind. Lisa ultimately convinced me to purchase canvases. There's a small gallery downtown that showcases them. She informed me that one day following class, local artists will be accepting submissions for their upcoming exhibition. After thorough consideration, I choose to submit some of your work. I chose and uploaded 3 of my greatest compositions, a triptych that symbolized my journey from betrayal to freedom. Weeks went by before I visited the exhibition, and I made an effort to keep my expectations low. My heart skipped a beat when I got an email in the afternoon, saying that the gallery wants to feature my work in their next. I felt both proud and vulnerable as I stood in front of my paintings on the night of the exhibition's opening. I displayed my artwork for everyone to see, expressing my feelings on canvas. A voice behind me exclaimed, "These are remarkable." I turned to see an older woman closely examining my triptych. "It's evident in these photos. Are you the artist?" I nodded and introduced myself. "I'm Eleanor, and I own a bigger gallery across the street." The woman smiled and held out her hand. "Hello, I'm interested in discussing the possibility of showcasing more of your work." As I spoke with Eleanor, I had a rush of joy beyond anything I could have imagined when I first took up a paintbrush once more. But more than that, I felt like my experiences, my suffering, and my development held significance and resonated deeply with people. Later that evening, as I sipped champagne and basked in my small victory, I couldn't help but consider, just a few months ago, I was a shell of myself, imprisoned in I was pursuing a career on my own, when my marriage lost its warmth. The path to pursuing my passion and improving the lives of others hadn't been simple. There had been times when I doubted I had a fear of being alone. But as I observed people interacting with my artwork at the gallery, and the friends I had made there, through my lectures I came to the crucial realization that I was no longer just getting by. I was flourishing because of the money. It's true that the lottery had given me new opportunities, but it was my own strength, tenacity that had enabled me to enter those doors. I had reconstructed my life according to my own standards, and I was pleased with the woman I was growing. And even though the future was still unknown, I felt a sense of peace descend upon me as I left the gallery that evening. I was eager to face it for the first time in a long time, despite the challenges involved. My new life was just beginning, and I was confident in my ability to overcome any challenges. As the months turned into years and the seasons changed, I was eager to see where my new life would lead me next. The girl, who used to live in constant fear of her husband's attitude, began to develop in ways I never would have thought possible. Swings and Remma's mother-in-law's chopping. A woman who stood strong and confronted the world. With I have confidence in my artistic endeavors, which began as a means of coping with my feelings, developed into more following the initial gallery exhibition, when doors started to open and Eleanor, as promised, included. Responses to my paintings at her downtown gallery were overwhelmingly positive. Talk to people. Following my first solo exhibition, Amelia Eleanor informed me that there's a sincerity and rawness in your work that appeals to viewers. Made me grin. I guess I've had to process a lot of the journey each painting represented, I said, adding that as my popularity increased, so did the due to time constraints. I had to balance commission requests with interviews and invites to national art fairs, which was thrilling and exhausting, but through. Despite everything, I never forgot my roots, the people who supported me, or the women's shelter fund I had, continued to expand, assisting in the escape of abusive relationships and the reconstruction of the lives of innumerable women. I made it a point to frequently visit the shelter, chat with the women there, and provide any assistance I could. I met Opia, a young mother of 2, during one of these visits, and she really made me think of myself from years ago. Her gaze used to evoke the same feelings of fear and doubt in me. But there was a difference. There was also a spark of resolve. But Sophia admitted, I don't know how to start over. I've been with him for so long that one day her voice was hardly audible above a whisper. I took her hand and gently squeezed it, unsure of who I would be without him. Believe me, you're stronger than you realize, even though it feels impossible right now. Starting again can be frightening, but it also presents an opportunity to rediscover your true self, as I have discovered. Through Sophia and other ladies who are similar to her, I discovered a new meaning in my life. I took seriously the responsibility that they could give others hope, despite their pain. Gave my life a depth that money could not purchase. Speaking of money, I had learned how to manage my wealth. I also established scholarships for promising artists from disadvantaged backgrounds. In addition to the Women's Shelter Fund, I donated to several charities close to my heart because the satisfaction of giving back far outweighed any financial rewards I received. Wealth could be provided for, but as I've discovered, life is never without its challenges. Challenges. Approximately 2 years after winning the lottery, I received a letter that brought my past back to life. Richard handed it to me, and I cautiously opened the package, unsure of what was inside. What to anticipate? Richard's disorganized scroll occupied several pages of the letter, Dear Amelia, which started with the words, I doubt you'll even read this, and I wouldn't hold it against you if you didn't. But I felt compelled to write to you. I slid into my favorite armchair, steeling myself as I apologized and explained. Richard's letter was filled with a complex series of explanations and apologies. He wrote about how his attempt to protest the lottery jackpot had failed, and how his life had fallen apart after our divorce. Terrible. Leaving him with escalating legal expenses and his already fragile firm collapsing under I reached my lowest point due to negative publicity and my own poor management, he stated. After drinking too much and gambling, I pushed away the little money I had left. Richard. It was only after losing everything that I realized the extent to which I had disregarded everyone who tried to help. Continued by saying that he had finally sought assistance, had been in treatment for his gambling addiction, and was going to. I didn't anticipate that he would be gradually reconstructing his life from the ground up after receiving regular therapy and working a regular job. I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to forgive me. The letter concluded. Know that I now realize how badly I treated you. You deserved so much better, and I sincerely apologize for anything that I was shocked to see tears streaming down my cheeks after reading about the anguish I caused you. Not tears of sorrow or sadness. For a long time, I had been waiting for Richard or Evelyn to make a move, but I was relieved. Suddenly returned to my life with more accusations and demands. This letter with its modest admissions and apologies, it felt like the end of a chapter. So I took some time to consider Richard's message before replying. To process my emotions, I spoke with my therapist, Dr. Chen, a knowledgeable woman. Dr. Chen gently reminded me that you don't owe him an answer, because he had been crucial in helping me process my trauma. You can recover without his apology or forgiveness. How you feel matters. I nodded appreciatively, as I know I always mentioned that for her insight. But I feel like I want to reply instead. For him. But after giving it some serious thought, I decided to truly end this phase of my life. I took the time to write Richard a quick but sincere note of gratitude. I sincerely apologized to him and wished him well as he continued his healing process. I also made it apparent that even though I valued what he said, our paths had permanently changed. I hope you're doing well. I wrote to Richard, but our time together is over. I've moved on, and I hope you will too. I was unaware that I had been suppressing my emotions, but sending that letter felt like a release. It was closure for me alone. Regarding Evelyn, I heard through the grapevine that her attempts to control had led to her own challenges. Her social circles shunned her as a result of the devastating backlash. As of the last time I heard, she had relocated to Florida, far from the gossip and critical gaze of our former neighborhood. After putting my past behind me, I plunged myself into the future with renewed energy, and my creativity kept developing. In light of my development and the fresh insights I had acquired, I launched a mentorship program for aspiring artists. Sharing the resilience and self-expression skills I'd gained from ORT, I also thought it was time for a change of scenery. I bought a stunning home on the Maine coast that included a studio with an ocean view. As a continual reminder of the ebb and flow of life, the rhythmic smashing of waves became the background of my life. There, in my coastal sanctuary, I began working on what would become my most well-known series to date. The paintings in Phoenix Rising documented my journey from the ashes of my previous existence to the as I stood in my gallery on opening night with friends and fellow artists. I realized what a vivid and fulfilling life I suddenly led. I felt a profound sense of appreciation for artists and art enthusiasts. My gaze moved from canvas to canvas, each one bearing witness to the difficulties I had surmounted and the fortitude I had discovered. The dark, chaotic betrayal that symbolized the night was inside of me. The awakening hung next to my broken world, where glimmerings of light started to emerge from the shadows. Rebirth burst with color and optimism, and the ascension displayed a figure that was definitely me, rising over the turbulence wings extending its magnificent Amelia. A voice spoke next to Lisa, a buddy from my first art class, was grinning warmly at me when I turned around. "You've come a long way." I returned her smile, feeling a knot in my throat. As the evening went on, I responded, reflecting on the value of Lisa's friendship to me over the years. As compliments on my art were abundant, I found myself taking a minute to think quietly outside on the gallery's balcony. The sky was full of stars, and the chilly night air smelled of salt from the nearby ocean. I considered it. My life has taken many unexpected turns, filled with hurt, betrayal, and terror. But also happiness, friendship, and self-discovery were the results of every event, whether positive or negative. Eleanor joined me on the balcony as the door behind me opened. "It was quite a night," she added, her eyes sparkling. "Amelia, you should be proud. You've made something genuinely unique." And I nodded as a feeling of calm descended upon me. As previously mentioned, a few years ago, I believed that winning the lottery was the greatest thing that had ever happened to me. But incorrect. Eleanor arched an eyebrow in curiosity, and I grinned as I peered out at the under the city's sparkling lights. The greatest thing that has ever occurred to me is learning how to stand on my own 2 feet. I have faith in myself to follow my passions and return the money I earn to others. Indeed, there were doors, but I chose to walk through them. Eleanor gave me a tight squeeze. "You touched my shoulder with love, and I'm delighted that you did. Now, return inside." I felt a flutter as I followed Eleanor back into the museum, where your public awaits. With anticipation for what lay ahead, my path had not been simple. It had brought me to a more fulfilling and it was more satisfying than I could have ever imagined. For the terrified, unsure woman who had left her house empty-handed. However, a woman who had accepted a position as a mentor, artist, and philanthropist took the duffel bag's place. She took charge of her own narrative, transformed it into something lovely, and interacted with the audience, discussing my artwork. Given the inspirations, I knew this was only the beginning of my greatest chapters. We're awaiting writing, and I was eager to see where they would take me.